Hello and welcome to China Focus. I'm Shelley Zhang. Now, New York Times reporter Chris Buckley last week was forced to leave the country after his journalist visa renewal did not come through. Now, that makes him the second New York Times reporter who's waiting in Hong Kong for a visa. The New York Times Beijing bureau chief, Philip Pan, has been waiting for his visa there since March. Now, Chris Buckley's visa situation made big news across Western media stationed in China. A lot of people have connected it with the New York Times reporting on Premier Wen Jiabao and his family's wealth. But is this a case of visa retaliation, or is there something else going on? Here today to talk about this issue, we have China analysts Jason Ma and Chen Zhifei. So, when the foreign media are talking about this and they're kind of connecting it to New York Times' recent reporting on China, do you think that's the reason behind this?
No, I don't think so. First of all, the person who really wrote the article about revealing Wen's family wealth, his visa was renewed without any problem. And second, Philip Pan's kind of visa was kind of rejected since last March, which is before the article was released. And also, my understanding is this whole thing, I mean, later on, it's more like the Western media kind of people, journalists, are very, very afraid of this kind of thing, because a lot of people, their livelihood is based on they getting a Chinese visa so that they can work in China. And this is always a kind of a very sensitive issue. Like they think China is a whole unit. Whenever you write anything wrong with them, they will retaliate and then get back to you. So they created this fear among themselves. But I don't think this is the reason.
So if it's not a case of retaliation, what the foreign ministry has said is that, it was because Chris Buckley used to work for Reuters and he never turned in his press card for Reuters. So it was kind of Reuters' fault for, not kind of formally saying that he was no longer their journalist. So that's why, China couldn't give him a new visa. So is that, a likely cause of it?
Remember that right now the government regime in China is still in a transitional period. And the new leadership under President Xi is trying to create a new environment that probably would help them avoid a similar fallout that happened with Bo Xilai's case. Recall what happened with Bo Xilai. What we saw, at least on my part, is a lot of the news information about Bo Xilai's case was first reviewed by none other than foreign media. We're looking at Wall Street Journal articles, New York Times articles that were the first in reporting the crime cases against Bo Xilai and his wife. So the regime, the authority probably have learned something, one or two things from that event, and now they're trying to tighten up. And I agree with Jason that none of these two people have any direct connection with revelation of Premier Wen Jiabao's riches and the family connections. So that's really making it all the more interesting.
So you're saying that they are kind of being made an example of, in essence, but it doesn't have something to do with the Wen Jiabao story.
Right. I don't think Wen Jiabao's story is something we really want to crack down. I mean, it's just like probably New York Times wants people look at them like a hero. They push that direction. But for me, I'm more looking at this kind of two, Philip Pan and Chris Buckley. And my understanding is they are two really, really good reporters, and they really can go to the details to ask the essence of the kind of the issue. And so this is the kind of the person they don't like to be.
So you're saying it's
China.
The reporters, not so much the media.
Right. It's more about the reporters themselves. And I agree with you. I mean, the Western media begin to play more and more role in Chinese kind of information system because of the internet. The Western reporting will quickly get into China. So the Chinese regime have a tight control of all the Chinese medias. But right now, with all this kind of report about China, the interest about China in the Western media, they feel they need to control more tightly about the Western media. And the way they can control it, they can't just kind of reject all the kind of visas. They pick those people who are very, very strong in Chinese issues. They really know Chinese. So they are not reporting the superficial thing. They are not asking the superficial question in the news press conference. I mean, so they target those people to set up example like either you ask all those kind of news agent, like you send some dumb people here, or you should behave yourself, something like that.
I think they're trying to achieve ends both for domestic people and also for foreign media corps. Because if you look at the domestic media market, they're trying to, like I said, to crack down on those people who have been very active providing news sources to Western media. Remember a couple of years ago, New York Times reporter, loosely affiliated with New York Times, named Zhao Yan, Chinese national, was arrested and was punished for several years imprisonment only because he tipped the New York Times for certain news event. And however, if you use that as kind of a yardstick, I don't know how many people would have been thrown into jail because of the Bush Lights case. Because if you look at those bureau chiefs for major news outlets in America, they got all kinds of new scoops about the Bush Light case. And if the government really want to crack down, they could get a lot of people running up. So I was wondering what had happened with the authority. Why they have been turning a blind eye to this very active kind of involvement of media in a Chinese system. That's one thing they want to achieve, that is to crack down on that, to stop people from providing news to foreign media. On the other side, they also want to apply pressure on New York Times, the similar organization, that, okay, if you have these people reporting on China, keep a close watch on us, we'll create trouble. We'll kick them out. So stop using those people. Stop giving them very important assignments.
So one thing I have to kind of clarify is, like you said, during the Bush Lights incidents, a lot of so-called kind of secret was released to the Western media. So the first kind of revolution, a lot of things was done by Western media. I consider this is a strategy of this power struggle inside the Chinese leadership, because they know they can't really release those things locally to the local kind of domestic media, because they are tightly controlled, and then somewhat they probably dare not report it. So they on purpose release that to the Western media. So Western media is already became a part of their strategy for the power struggle, and that's the reason it's tolerated. But sometimes some kind of reporters, they are so sharp. They ask a question where probably some faction don't really want to ask. For example, the Chris Buckley asked the question to kind of Wen Jiabao at the end of the press conference, and then the answer of Wen Jiabao directly lead to the rest of Bush Light. And at least that caused a faction of Chinese leader really hate Chris Buckley. I mean, so that's the reason. I mean, when you ask this kind of very sharp question, cause this direct consequence of a falling of one faction, you may get kind of retaliation from that faction.
So during the power struggle, the factions are using Western media or domestic media in that way to leak information. If they're cracking down now, does that mean that's not going to be tolerated anymore? That power struggle's over? There's not going to be any more leaks?
You can see that as a kind of a truce or a kind of a general statement of the higher authority, the ultimate authority of the regime, that says, okay, all parties quit the job of co-opting Western media to convey their message. You can really interpret it that way.
But for me, I'm more kind of consider this as a way kind of just kind of give some warning of act out of one faction, because we know right now Liu Yunshan, he was in charge of this propaganda kind of bureau, and now he's a part of the standing committee, and he's still very strong about controlling media, and he is considered as a strong affiliation with the Jiang faction, and I think he may be the person kind of have this kind of make this happen, so that he want to make people feel like, okay, you should really not go against the Jiang faction.
But if you look at these two people's background, I don't think, especially in the case of Philip Pan, he really didn't report that much about the recent power struggle. However, he had a longer history of reporting on what I said, the internal crisis of the Chinese regime, starting with SARS crisis, starting with Chen Guangcheng, all those human rights tragedies. So I don't think it's probably one faction of the party. I think it's probably general will or,
I think
kind of intention of the party to crack down on Western media.
The most famous thing done by, at least I think, Philip Pan was his revelation of the secret behind the self-elimination of Falun Gong practitioners. He did a kind of personal investigation showing like what the Chinese government claims Falun Gong kind of burned himself in Tiananmen Square is indeed not Falun Gong practitioner. He did that in-depth investigation, and I think that make him considered
that was back in 2001, though.
But that's really hurt the Chiang faction, and so that make him enemy of Chiang faction.
So let me ask, if you're saying that the party is kind of doing this to warn off Western journalists, in effect, do you think this actually affects how they cover China? Will it affect, decisions by journalists and China experts if they feel like, okay, I may not get my visa? Because they have to be renewed every year, their journalist visa.
So this is huge. I mean, the Chinese government is saying it, and when with the kind of increasing status of Chinese economy, Chinese status in the world, so this became a real threat to all the journalists. But meanwhile, I do think the journalists should kind of do what they should do. Otherwise, they lose their value to be in China.
Well, let me ask. The Foreign Correspondents Club of China has done surveys over the last 2 years about journalists getting visa renewals, and they found 2008, as of May of 2008, almost a third of the people responding said they had problems getting new visas and or getting their renewed visas, and they said even 21 people said they were directly told it was because of their reporting. Now, what can media organizations do? Is there anything they can do to kind of, like fight back against maybe having their journalist visas taken away for their reporting?
It would be very hard for the media organizations to react in that way because there was a little wiggle room. If the Chinese government wanted to stop them from their regular operation in China, they could take all the means to achieve that end. I think that's what's happening already. And all they do, I think, is they can publicize these kind of events, just as New York Times is doing. I think that could help their case.
But this is really unbalanced kind of a battlefield. I mean, Chinese have unlimited kind of access to the Western world. They can put a TV station, everything they want, but meanwhile, they control everything in China. You can't really put your kind of a TV kind of channel in Chinese, ordinary people's life. Meanwhile, they control everything. They use every way to control the Western journalist. So I guess the government, U.S. government or Western government should play some role in this case. Because
I was going to ask that question because Evan Osnos from The New Yorker wrote an article where he said, the State Department should talk about this publicly.
Right. On the other hand, you should see this as a positive sign because there have been reports that there are up to 500 million Chinese people who have ready access to internet. Well, there are also 200 million Chinese who are microbloggers. So the influence and extent of their effect on Western media is on the rise. That means all these actions taken by the government, Chinese government, is a sign of the insecurity and also the success of Western media. I think they should continue the current path and really go on plunging ahead with the reporting of Chinese in a faithful way. And I think that's really great service to reform and open up the country.
Yeah, they should make big deal of every case like this. They shouldn't really talk behind the door. I mean, like what the Southern Weekly was doing. I mean, whenever something on kind of justice happened, they should really review it. I mean, I think if you just kind of discuss it behind the curtain, there will be no change, no pressure from the Chinese government part to change.
So if the kind of news organizations come out more publicly and like talk about when their journalists get their visas denied, things like that, or if the State Department comes out and said, what do you think the effect will be on the Chinese side?
I think they will, in the future, be very careful whenever they do it. They should have a very reasonable kind of explanation behind every this kind of instance. Right now, they can just do kind of randomly. They can arbitrarily. So if you keep up the pressure, ask a question for everyone, every kind of reject visa, then they may kind of dramatically reduce this kind of instance from happening.
Okay, well, thank you both for joining us today and talking about this issue. And thank you for watching. For more on this and other issues in China, join us at ntd.tv.